McFadden, had the immediate task of finding a new home for the White House. For the past 12 hours, he was running the country and conducting business from inside Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. It was one of the best protected military installations in the world, but it was cramped and already running short on space. The mountain normally will hold 2,000 people, and now with the current government running from there, it is well over capacity. After such a devastating attack, the president was unwilling to uproot the daily activities of one of the few fully operational command centers in the world. So he's looking for another secure accommodation immediately. June 25, 2050 would be the first full day as president, and it was going to be memorable if he could find a new home for the White House. The new White House had to be centrally located, easy to protect, and he preferred a large military presence already in place and untouched by the nukes and fallout. Less than a week ago, the world was attacked by the radicals, rendering most of the large coastal cities and waterways destroyed and inaccessible for at least 500 years. Recovery and rebuilding were the top of his priorities now. His first choice for the new White House was Fort Knox, Kentucky. It had some of the best security in the world. It was self-sufficient with redundant power supply completely inside the facility or underground. Solar, wind, and multi-fuel generators constantly recharge the battery banks below the main buildings. The massive and reliable batteries would provide power for the foreseeable future. The power grid could be run or charged on all known fuels, and even without solar, it was a 2-year supply of diesel fuel to ensure there was no interruptions. Solar will be off for everyone soon. His team reported a constant thick cloud cover and a slight but continuous temperature drop outside. Nuclear winter would be the final nail in the coffin for everything left in a few days, McFadden thought. Right after he assumed office, the president coordinated and ordered a massive retaliatory strike on the 5 member countries of the cabal. Those rogue nations and their leadership who attacked the West no longer existed, as of a few minutes ago. The Big Three coalition pilots confirmed complete annihilation, and he didn't doubt them. Unfortunately, the members of the Big Three, he liked that name as soon as he heard it just a second ago on the radio, had ordered additional strikes on many of their past enemies in various regions of the world. He had given secondary targets to his pilots, but he also left it up to them individually to decide what to do. From all accounts, no aircraft were damaged except those hard landings Russia planned for a few of its long-range bombers. Russia reported success before going radio silent. China's last radar transmission was in plain English. "Thank you for your help in this matter," and went silent. With no debrief possible, the majority of pilots involved in the deadliest conflict in human history, the president had only his men to rely on for his after-actions report, and it would be sorely short of facts. President McFadden had already decided against martial law for the nation. The country was reeling and hamstrung enough. He'd let the people defend themselves, gather in groups for relief efforts, and pray in any manner they chose in any house of worship they wanted. The president had already issued a recall order for all deployed Navy vessels to return to any safe harbor in the best possible speed. As they approached the coast, they were to assess the damage and report it to the mountain. McFadden knew 80% of the fleet was sitting idle in port or dry dock, but he also knew one aircraft carrier was unaccounted for. It had launched early in the morning of June 19th and was still unaccounted for. It's still unknown. There was also 21 nuclear-capable submarines out there not reporting in. He knew he had to find those mission ships and their crews immediately. If any one of those vessels went rogue, it would be disastrous. The firepower each possessed must be contained and controlled immediately. As he prepared his first press release as president, the ham radio on the desk came alive and reports of suicide bombers at synagogues in the southwest U.S. McFadden feared a second nuclear strike was always a possibility, but this was unexpected. He yelled down the hallway for everyone with a ham radio to turn it on and scan for information immediately. The Air Force Staff Sergeant sitting closest to the new president's office was annoyed. Sergeant Jefferson sat at his desk for 5 years, and this was the first time anyone yelled down the hallway. It was not how things are done inside the mountain. Given a chance, Sergeant Jefferson would show the president where the office-wide intercom button is on his phone. The big red button must have escaped his attention. As the command center tuned in the news reports, a pattern became clear and a theory was voiced out loud. It appeared only groups of people in cities unharmed by the initial strikes were targets. But as reports continued, radio towers, power plants, hospital emergency rooms, and first responders were also being hit by what someone on the ground in Santa Fe, New Mexico called the Zealots. The suicide bombers were shouting about Allah when they blew themselves up. The working theory was the cabal pre-planned a response with sleeper agents already in place in case any country retaliated for their earlier attacks. With no reliable nationwide high-speed communication currently available, McFadden would have to use his ham radio to issue orders and also use it for his response to those new bombings. President told his aides in the Mountains Operations Center to get on the radio and explain the U.S. government's needed them to relay information to the mountain directly, and we would like a secure communications line to as many ham operators worldwide as possible. That last part may be a reach, but the president needed it because currently all other forms of communication were faltering. The ham radio was the only way to communicate. Using it for comms between military units will save lives, but the operators must cooperate for it to work. Within minutes of the broadcast, many ham operators around the globe were openly mocking such a bold request, and all seemed to think it was some kind of joke. Soon enough, though, a few started to triangulate the location of the outrageous statements and the transmission source. A Canadian ham operator out of Calgary was the first to verify the transmission's location with pinpoint accuracy. When he announced Cheyenne Mountain as the source, the radio was momentarily silent for the first time since the nukes dropped 5 days ago. A second later, a slew of questions from hundreds of operators on nearly every bandwidth launched mostly useless and inane questions at the mountain. The president knew he had to be the one to shut everybody up so they could listen to his requests. Without prompting from the new staff provided by the two-star general in charge of the mountain, McFadden walked down the corridor to the stairs, descended 3 flights, and stepped in unannounced to the mountain's main communication center. As he walked, he gathered his thoughts in a short statement for broadcast. Just hours ago, he took note of the comm center during his brief tour when he arrived. Someone yelled, "Room, attention!" and everyone snapped instantly to their feet. President McFadden said thank you and waved them off to continue their duties. The president, still in his Marine uniform, did not have a chance to try on one of the 5 suits someone presented him with this morning. Protocol dictated the president wear a proper suit when conducting his duties. McFadden didn't have time for protocol and would wear his Marine dress uniform until he felt like changing. He'd seen the man who was in charge as soon as he entered the room. He approached the Air Force Senior Master Sergeant Coates with a hand extended, but was quickly rendered a sharp salute in response to the E-8 showing proper respect with his perfect rendered salute. He knew the senior NCO Corps ran the day-to-day operations in the military, and it would not be any different here. A moment ago, as he crossed the room, McFadden ignored the Air Force major standing between him and the senior NCO. He also knew if he stopped to chat with everyone in front of him, he'd never get anything done. Sergeant Coates introduced himself and asked how he could help. President McFadden got right to it. I need to make a broadband announcement over the ham radio to ask for help with the current crisis. I wanted to know if there was a possibility to do it immediately. Sergeant Coates said his people would have him on the air in 3 minutes. The president said do it. 3 minutes later, with the most powerful ham radio transmitter in North America at his fingertips, the president stepped over to the desk and microphone, sat down, and asked for help. He introduced himself and wanted the operators and listeners to know he appreciated everything they were doing to keep the world informed. He hoped the nation could count on them to continue the news and updates and message traffic. He specifically wanted help issuing directives to the military and first responders around the world. Everyone listening was transfixed by what the new president was asking. It was an authoritative but calm and inviting voice speaking, and the message implied the communication system worldwide were not coming back anytime soon, like many speculated. Hundreds of operators answered back, all offering to help, and many offering advice but were politely ignored. Anyone who had sent an encryption key for the secure communications was given priority. so the world could get back to saving itself. As soon as the president stepped away from the comm center, he was handed a tablet with the most recent updates on the Zealot attacks. Reports globally so far said in under 2 hours, 2,500 attacks were reported and tens of thousands of dead, including many heads of state. It wasn't clear how their security was breached, but the president had to find out and be prepared for it. His personal security was just as important as the people around him, and he had to do whatever it took to secure America's leadership for the future. Inside the mountain, they were still on high alert status, ThreatCon Delta. He felt this was the most secure place he could be at the moment, and he went back to composing messages and directives to be transmitted around the world. It was lunchtime in the mountain, but no food was being served because of the threat level. The base chow hall was closed for the past 6 months for asbestos and lead paint removal, and it was completely blocked and sealed off. Only the hazmat suit crowd could enter. No one in the mountain knew it was all an elaborate ruse. To feed 2,000 people 3 times a day, a veteran-owned catering business was hired out of Colorado Springs to bring the cafeteria-style bulk meals for the hungry crews there. It was working perfectly up until the bombs went off. Security of the mountain was already tight, but a global nuclear attack made the base impossible to enter. By the end of the first day, the mountain's commanding officer, Major General Finn, was starving. 5 days after the nuke attacks, he'd eaten every snack available and was still packing sandwiches from home each morning. He was sick of MREs, and there was no edible food anywhere on the base. Now the attacks had subsided, he could think about something else. Food wasn't served in the mountain because of the lockdown, and it meant no one, including him, could eat anything but food from home or MREs. He called the chief of security, Lieutenant Colonel Madsen, on the intercom and asked him to come up and see him immediately. Madsen was chewing on something when he walked in and quickly swallowed whatever it was without comment. Madsen had a stash of cookies somewhere and ignored General Finn. He ignored the chewing and asked how long until the caterer could re-enter the base and feed everyone. Madsen said he'd put an extra team on the commercial gate to search the trucks and get them up in the space they'd been using for the past 6 months. Finn thanked him and went back to thinking about where he could get his own cookie. The trucks were called back to the mountain to serve supper as soon as it was practical. With the attacks over and recovery underway, the scheduled food delivery would resume. Jose and his food crew, as his shirts all said, were ready to feed the 2,000 hungry people there. He and his crew had worked this job for 6 months now and were well known and liked by everyone he fed. Hungry patrons had no idea the chow hall repairs were fake and were planned to allow a group of infiltrators to entrance to the mountain for sabotage. The leader of the cabal had personally recruited Abdul, now called Jose, years ago to move to the United States with his brothers and their families and build a terrorist sleeper cell inside a friendly mosque and await orders. With excellent fake identification and a language coach, they began to transition to look and sound like Mexican workers. They had bought their names and background information for cash as soon as they arrived. The people they were replacing were all U.S.-born or naturalized citizens, and they were killed and buried in the deepest part of the Arizona desert, never to be found. The plan they came up with was to open a veteran-owned business near a military installation and infiltrate the base and await orders. The fake chow hall repairs and catering took a bit of time to plan, but the business was the perfect cover for them until they were called upon. Over the past 6 months, they'd smuggled bomb vests and large quantities of binary liquid explosives into the mountain. When properly packed and concealed, it was completely undetectable to bomb dogs and electronic sniffers. They would each assemble a suicide vest in the closed chow hall's massive cooler while the others served food. Only one person at a time would enter the cooler, disappearing for a few minutes each time, never drawing suspicion. Parts of Abdul Jose's orders were to wait several hours after any attacks for his countrymen. That left his beloved homeland, Hearing the news attacks on his countrymen, he had no idea what was left of his beloved homeland. But soon he'd be with his mother and father in paradise, and all would be perfect again. Today was the day. He was lucky. The wait meant striking at dinner time when most of the infidels would be present in the temporary chow hall. Food was set up, and service began as normal. As always, the food crew had a few deliveries to make in the mountain to the senior staff in the room on level 3. Like every other meal, his people loaded food onto the serving carts for deliveries. The one difference today was each of the members of the food crew was wearing a concealed suicide vest. Having already said their prayers and absolutions, when the carts rolled out of the elevator on the third floor, they were at peace and ready to meet Allah. It was more food than normal to deliver because they were asked to pack a separate cart for a dignitary and his staff. When the men pushed their carts and greeted everyone they passed as usual, as instructed, they walked the 2 carts as the opposite ends of the long hallway. At one end, they were let in like every other meal, but at the other opposite end, a group of our Marines stood guard and started inspecting the food in the cart. As they did so, a man in a Marine dress uniform opened the door and seemed excited to finally eat. Before he lost his nerve, Ishmael, Jorge, quickly pressed the hidden button in his sleeve, triggering his explosive vest. He was 10 feet from the man in the doorway when the entire hallway was instantly filled with steel ball bearings and broken pieces of glass traveling at supersonic speed. At the other end of the hallway, an equally large blast happened a split second later, killing the mountain's senior leadership instantly. Down in the busy chow hall, over 1,000 men and women gathered to eat and were shredded by the blast and shrapnel when 8 suicide vests went off from all sides of the crowded room. The main ops room also had a visitor from the caterers. Elam was delivering food to the break room when he saw his chance not only to destroy the exit, trapping all non-believers, but he could also dive into the room and blow up most of the equipment and the people inside. As soon as he felt the deep rumblings of the other explosions, he jumped into the room and detonated his vest, killing dozens, but also trapping the surviving ops crew when the roof collapsed above the doorway. For months, most of the fake repair crews had worked removing non-existent lead paint, and a few foot servers were in the back of the food storage locker digging into the concrete. The noise the rest of the repairmen made covered up their insidious plan to cripple the whole mountain in one blast. They had found the area directly above the main generator and the enormous fuel supply for a year's operation. Digging for a few hours at a time for months, they tunneled through the 4 feet of reinforced concrete. It wasn't easy with small power tools never designed for such heavy work. When they started it 6 months ago, they knew the deadline and they made it with 2 weeks to spare. Bringing in gallons of the binary liquid explosive proved surprisingly easy. Once a week when they wheeled in the packaged drinks for the Air Force personnel, they also had liters of one part or the other of the explosives hidden in a few of the very last containers of juice and soda. When they finally broke through the concrete floor, they climbed inside, cleaned up the dust and the mess they'd made around the massive generators, and they also fashioned a fake ceiling from cardboard and paint and attached it in such a way they could knock it down at the last moment, delivering the explosives right before detonation. The fake ceiling limited their exposure and prevented maintenance workers from seeing what they had done in the past 5 months. With 150 liters of binary explosive right in the generator room, there would be no chance of any power would be produced in the mountain for years to come. The Zealots also hoped it would be enough to destroy the bank of elevator shafts to the north of the adjacent fuel supply. They took a guess and doubled the amount of liquid explosives needed and prayed to Allah for guidance and help. When the massive binary explosive went off, it shook the mountain to its core. The last giant hammer strike killed or trapped everyone dead or dying in near total darkness, with only a few weak emergency lights allowing the injured to see the devastation. Minutes before the first bomb went off on the surface by the main entrance of the mountain, Mika, Rosa, was making her daily stop at the main gate to feed the hungry Air Force security forces guarding the entrance to the complex. The armed men and women had learned when she came around with leftovers and pastries they did not want to miss out. Each day she worked, Rosa would have a smoke, flirt, and be gone before the shift leader could complain. This was her final day on Earth before she was given her reward by Allah, everlasting paradise. As the evening shift gathered around, she was as sweet and fun to talk to as always. When the crowd was as large as it ever got, she handed the tray of goodies to an infidel, put an unlit cigarette in her mouth, and said, "Does anyone got a light for a girl in need?" And she reached into her pocket and pressed the button that ignites her suicide vest. The guards at the far side of the complex first saw the bright flash of light by the main gate and felt the low underground rumble. They didn't put the two together until hours later when it was determined the rumble was underground explosives sealing the entrance to the mountain completely, trapping and killing all inside. The Cheyenne Mountain complex was dead and buried along with the shortest U.S. presidency in history, 36 hours. When the news broke that the ham operators could no longer reach their recent partners in the mountain, mobile ham operators tried to drive there to see what was going on and broadcast it to the world. But the bombings and chaos were not limited to just Cheyenne Mountain. It was worldwide. Local roads were impassable with all the new bombings and attacks on first responders and civilians. Bridges were burning, fire trucks were crashed and turned over. Reports being broadcast seemed unbelievable. The cities were under siege, and no one could get control. Radio operators were repeating the news of escalating violence around any group, religious center, or hospital. Some of the broadcasters went offline when their repeater towers were hit in the new round of destruction. Mobile and handheld operators were now the sole source of news globally, at least momentarily. The recordings described a blind rage from the survivors of the zealots' attack. Reports were broadcast about people everywhere spontaneously attacking and killing every Muslim they knew or anyone they suspected was a follower of Allah. The day of rage had started, and it burned out quickly, with the killing of neighbors and people standing near them. There were very few first-hand accounts recorded for posterity. The world would never know what had happened, and decades later, questions were asked. What happened on June 25th, 2050 to cause the mass killing of half of the world's population? That's a good place to stop for today. Hope you enjoyed Chapter 3. I'll see you tomorrow.